Hello, everybody. Thank you for coming to our webinar today about marijuana policy. We'll be talking about what happened this year, and it's been a big year, and then what we think might happen in next year and then in the immediate future. So I am thrilled to have our panel here, and so let me get started. So first, I'm going to say hello. I'm Karen. I'm with Bill Track 50. We do legislation tracking. And so I am just the host. This is not about me today. I am thrilled to have the amazing panel that we've got here today. And I am going to have them introduce themselves. So Tom, could you tell us a little bit about yourself and your organization?
Sure. I am the editor and publisher of Marijuana Moment, which is a news site that tries to track everything and anything having to do with marijuana policy and politics, along with science and health, culture, some business stuff as well. And there's a lot of that going on. So we keep pretty busy. We have a daily newsletter that people can subscribe to stay updated on all the relevant cannabis developments. And yeah, we started Marijuana Moment in 2017. And I personally have been working on marijuana and drug policy for over 20 years now, most of that time as an activist working for various nonprofits like Students for Sensible Drug Policy and Law Enforcement Against Prohibition and others. And I'm happy to be here to talk about the weed bills.
Excellent. So glad you could come. Hey, Justin, who would you say you are?
Hello. Well, isn't that the question we're all trying to answer? Hey, everybody. My name is Justin Strekal, and for the last 5 years, I've been NORML's federal lobbyist and national political director. And I am very, very excited to talk with you about everything that went down this year and a little bit of 2020, because I think the tail end of 2020 is super important as well. And then talk about what to expect moving forward at the state, local, and federal levels. Because right now, we need heroic bureaucrats and activists and advocates in every level. So really excited you guys are tuning in.
Did you want to say anything about NORML?
Oh, yeah, I work for NORML, the National Organization for the Reform of Marijuana Laws. NORML's been around since 1970. And since then, tens of thousands of activists have picked up the banner and organized to push for state, local, and federal reforms. And you can find out more at norml.org.
Great, thank you. And Karen, so excited to have you back again for our annual webinar this year. Please introduce yourself.
I'm Karen O'Keefe. I direct the state legislative department at the Marijuana Policy Project. I've been with MPP forever, since 2003, back when there was about 30% popular support for legalization. And I've had the pleasure of working with many, many people on passing medical cannabis decriminalization and legalization laws. And MPP has been around since 1995 and played a leading role in 11 of the 19 legalization laws, and a lot of others, worked hand in hand with many allies and lawmakers.
So you mentioned that support for marijuana legalization was 30% when you started. Where is it now? 68%
according to Gallup.
68%? Well, you must be pretty proud of yourself.
It's just me. That's
so happy to include you this year. Please, could you introduce yourself?
Yes, hi, my name is Shaleen. I'm a founder of Parabola Center, which is a drug policy think tank, and we seek to give everybody, especially people with fewer resources, the tools to be involved in the policy-making process. So needless to say, this is a very exciting webinar for me to be a part of. I have about 20 years in drug policy, also at Students for Sensible Drug Policy, Law Enforcement Against Prohibition, where I was lucky enough to work with Tom for some time. I also have worked on multiple campaigns with Marijuana Policy Project, have great respect for them, and I'm a very proud member of NORML for the past probably 20 years.
Perfect. Well done. All right, so I'm going to go ahead and close the poll, and I think that will publish it, but in case it doesn't, it looks like we've got 22% of people said they're interested citizen, 34% of the people here said they're an activist, 34% said that they have a business that is marijuana related, so that's pretty exciting actually, and 9% said, you know, they're just here. So I'm going to end the poll. Let's see if that pops up. Maybe that put it on the screen again. I don't know, it's not on my screen, but okay, great. So there you go. So that is who we are talking to today, which is great. I am going to go ahead and put that away now. Here we go. All right. So again, please do put, well, let me move to the next slide. This is the agenda for today. So we are going to be starting with federal bills. So we'll start at a high level, like what's going on with the new administration, and then we'll talk about some specific examples. Then we'll move on to state legislation and talk about what happened this year, and it was plenty. And we'll talk about not just legalization, but also decrim, which we can define, and expungement and other things, and then also broader drug trends, which are of interest, and an interesting exploration of how the state Supreme Courts have come in to matter to us in this topic. Then we are going to talk about regulations. We haven't done that in this webinar in the past, but it is time that we start talking about regulations. So as all the states start passing these laws, what is the next thing that happens? So that is going to be our third topic. And then we will finish by looking forward and talking about what we think might happen at the federal level and at the state level, ballot initiatives and legislation. And at the end of each of these topics, I'm going to stop and let the panelists all weigh in, and then also ask the audience if you have any questions. So if you would hold your questions until the end of the section, then we will discuss, and then we'll move on to the next section. And then if we have time at the end, we're going to have a little bit of a free-for-all. So I hope we have time. And then we will take audience questions on any topics that are on your mind, so that whatever you're thinking about, if we didn't cover it, we can talk about it at the end. So that is how we will be handling this. And again, question panel, if you've got a question, go ahead and type it in. And then at the end, we'll let you use your audio, but not during the presentation. And then also the chat is for you to chat with all the different people who are here on the webinar, meet some people, network. That is great. Go ahead and do that. So the chat, I'm not monitoring it for questions. If you have a question, you're going to need to put it into the question panel. All right, so let's dive in. Start with a quote, which I stole from the Marijuana Policy Project website, but can't get enough Carl Sagan. So who could say it better? Okay, with that, let us do this thing, starting with the federal level. So as you might know, we have a new president this year, which means a new administration. So maybe that means things have changed. Maybe they haven't. So let's talk at a high level about what's going on. So first, I made a quick chart of how many bills mention marijuana in each of the last several Congresses. So this is about 10 years of stuff. And every year there's more bills that mention marijuana or cannabis. And of course, the 117th, the current Congress, is a little less than halfway through. So we can absolutely guess that it's going to be, again, more than the year before it. So for sure, it's a topic. But what are they saying? So at a high level, I'm going to throw it to Justin to talk about, with the new administration, how does that change the convo in DC? Justin?
Oh, no, thank you so very much, Karen. And just for those of you who are looking at the previous slide, it's important to make the distinction in what Karen mentioned briefly, which is each one of those numbers at the bottom, that's the session of Congress. So each one of those are 2-year increments. So here we are in December, the first year of the 117th session. So we do expect many more, as you indicated, and it's just been a huge rise in the last few years. As all of you probably remember, there was an election last year. And in it, we elected a new president, as well as maintained a democratically controlled House, and a Senate election left November, which was ultimately decided in January of this year, leaving the chamber split 50-50 in a partisan divide, and empowering Vice President Kamala Harris to be the tie-breaking vote, effectively giving the chairmanships and control of the chamber to the Democratic Party. You know, there's a lot of ways that we can approach this. I could sell you the rosy optimistic version. I could sell you the pessimistic negative version, but I think I'm just going to try to be as candid as possible here, where, you know, in President Joe Biden, we have one of the chief architects in the escalation of the war on drugs during the 1990s and throughout his career as senator, including when he was the chairman of the very powerful and ultimately influential on drug policy Judiciary Committee. It has been profoundly frustrating for me as an advocate, and I'm sure for many of you, to see such inaction by the administration. Especially when on the campaign trail, then as candidate for president, Joe Biden committed to Senator Cory Booker that he supported the expungements and erasure of criminal convictions and committed that he as president would do so. To date, here we are now 11 months into his administration, and he has yet to take any action whatsoever.
Wait, he took action. They fired White House staffers for using marijuana.
Correction, he continued the policy of firing and denying employment to staffers within the White House. So yes, the administration did terminate people as well as deny employment to people for THC consumption. But that's nothing new, Tom. That's been going on for quite some time. But yeah, it was a notable thing earlier this year when that did come out, just given the cultural shift that we've seen and how the goalposts and the norms for the public have dramatically shifted, where when we see as far as policy change, they've remained stagnant in criminalization, prohibition, and oppression. But you know, one thing, so I talked about the pardons provision of it. Tom mentioned the employment practices. One other thing that I would note about the Biden administration that is particularly frustrating is what their line is on the administration's position for marijuana, where the administration, including the press secretary, has repeatedly articulated that they say they support decriminalization and rescheduling the substance to Schedule II to facilitate research. The problem with that line is that it's inherently contradictory, because there is no way, shape, or form anyone can argue that changing the schedule from Schedule I as it currently stands, analogous to heroin, to Schedule II, where it would be analogous to cocaine, could be described as decriminalized. It would simply be criminalized to a lesser extent with lesser penalties depending on the tiers. So, you know, we can say a lot of different things to characterize the administration's position. I say it's contradictory, and you know, other people have called it an outright lie. Other people call it aspirational. It's a very difficult position that we find ourselves in now. But largely, given Joe Biden's long-standing track record of supporting criminalization, the fact that the administration has not taken any public efforts to articulate a continued support for prohibition in and of itself can be viewed as an evolution of the president's thinking. So there's a ways to go. The biggest change, though, as I mentioned, is the Congress. The fact that now, as a result of actions in the previous session of Congress, we have House leadership that has successfully brought to the floor and passed legislation to normalize the commercial sale of marijuana by passing the Safe Banking Act, as well as the previous House passed, oh, thank you, Karen. The previous House passed the MORE Act, the Marijuana Opportunity Reinvestment and Expungement Act, which would have ended federal marijuana prohibition and ensured that a low tax rate to generate federal revenue, then that would be perpetually reinvested into the communities that have been harmed via various grant-making programs to facilitate expungements, to promote minority ownership in the emerging industry, and for general community reinvestment grants in the sections of the country where we've seen historically the highest level of over-policing, AKA Black and brown communities that have had their neighborhoods feel more like occupied territories than communities. So we started the new session with the same House leadership, but new Senate leadership. And in that new Senate leadership, we now have, for the first time in American history, have a Senate majority leader who has expressly articulated support for ending prohibition and has a legislative record of introducing legislation that would actually do that. So I know on here, just bringing up what's on the screen, I briefly touched on the Safe Banking Act, I briefly touched on the MORE Act. The data collection, there have been a laundry list of bills that have been introduced that would address that, as well as research bills. We did see in the previous Congress, each chamber of Congress pass some form of research bill, but we did not see any of them enacted into law because they were different. And then we saw numerous pieces of legislation geared towards specifically veterans healthcare components that we're continuing to work going forward. And then lastly on the screen is there was included earlier this year on the infrastructure bill, very narrow language that would allow researchers to conduct experiments pertaining to impairment factors for cannabis as it relates to driving. So a lot has
just really quick about that infrastructure language. The key thing about that is that it requires certain federal departments and agencies to come up with a plan for allowing researchers to actually access the marijuana products that consumers are buying in state legal markets rather than just using government grown marijuana, which has been the case to date.
Yes, very true. That's where we stand now. What hasn't been introduced formally yet, but has been a discussion draft has been made public, and thousands of comments have been submitted to the Senate offices that put it forward, is the Senate package known as the Cannabis Administration and Opportunity Act, or the COA bill. And that is what Senate Majority Leader Schumer and Senators Booker and Wyden have put forward as their vision for moving forward. So it's not an actual bill yet. They're soliciting all kinds of feedback. I know, Tom, you didn't submit comments, I don't think, formally, but I know that NORML did, MPP did, and Shaleen with the Parabola Center did. So I would encourage you, maybe we can send this out in the notes that we can send all of our comments out there so people can know. But it's a really exciting time, considering that there is finally kind of a light at the mountaintop of the ability to get things done, possibly. But I don't know if, oh, and Lloyd, no, don't worry, we're getting there, Lloyd. But you know, it's still, this is still Congress that we're talking about, and where we have a dramatically broken system that is just not move very fast. Kara, what's the next slide?
So at this point, I'm going to ask the other panelists if they have a federal bill that they would like to highlight, or anything interesting that they see that happened in 2021 that they would like to highlight. And then we will turn to the audience for any questions they've got about federal legislation.
Oh, I thought we had another slide that had the SRA on it. Oh, no, I lied. Okay. Oh, if you don't mind, before other folks go, I don't know why I thought we had an SRA slide. There was another piece of legislation that was just introduced a couple weeks ago, known as the States Reform Act. This marks the first time that a Republican representative has introduced a bill that would end federal marijuana prohibition, as well as address components related to what's commonly referred to as social equity. There's explicit language regarding expungement policy, and there's explicit language regarding directing the SBA to engage and use the full weight of its resources to support entrepreneurs entering the space. And then another bill was introduced just a week ago, known as the HOPE Act, or the Harnessing Opportunities Through Pursuing Expungements Act, that had an interesting duo between it's led by Republican Dave Joyce of Ohio and Democrat Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez of New York, commonly referred to as AOC. And what this bill would do is it would appropriate $2 million a year, which is entirely inadequate, but it's a good starting place. $2 million a year over 10 years to the Department of Justice to give grants to local units of government if they are to be used to facilitate expungements. Because it's important to remember, almost all criminal convictions in the United States are given not by federal law enforcement, but by state and local law enforcement. So we really need to make sure that we can empower local units of government and state governments to take action to expunge those records. And the way that we do that is through carrots and sticks at the federal level. So this is a good carrot bill. So those are the other two things that we didn't mention. And panelists, I don't know if you want to, if I missed anything or you want to add.
I'll just add two quick things.
I think I'm going to go right to the audience questions to try to keep us on time. And obviously everybody will get a chance to talk when we get to the end. So I'm going to go right to Jackie, who asked, why are we still talking about legalization, which automatically comes with additional taxes and regulation, instead of the simpler and more effective decrim and deschedule? We don't need more taxes, and we certainly don't need federal regulations. How do we get this message to the folks in DC? Who would like to field that?
I'll mention one thing. We define decriminalization typically as being when somebody's not jailed for cannabis, but it often includes a civil fine or something like that. So legalization can be with or without taxes. For example, in Vermont, initially the legislature legalized possession and cultivation and didn't add on sales and regulated markets until a couple of years later. So just for what we use for terminology, legalization would be regardless of if there's taxes. Decrim is typically like a traffic ticket.
I co-sign.
Comments? All right. So I'm going to move on now. So that was kind of the federal picture. So let's look at what happened in 2021 at the state level. So we'll do a roundup of what states legalized and where we're at, and then talk about a few other topics besides legalization. So to start, I've got the map from the Marijuana Policy Project website, and there's a link to it at the bottom. And again, I'm sending you these slides tomorrow, so you'll have all of these links and you can look at all of this information and read more. So I'm going to throw this to Karen to talk about the new states that legalized this year and a little bit about each one, which I've highlighted on this slide.
Great. So in all of history before this year, a total of 2 states had made marijuana legal through the legislative process as opposed to voter initiatives. This year, that number, 2 times that many states legalized just this year alone. So we had 4 different state legislatures legalize and regulate cannabis for adults 21 and older: New York, Connecticut, Virginia, and New Mexico. And one really exciting thing was not only was this a record-breaking number of states, they also were very wide in their scope. They included a lot of criminal justice reform, provisions to make sure that the industry is diverse and equitable, and most of the states had the bulk of tax revenue, or a very significant percent, distributed to social equity and to communities that are hard hit by the war on drugs. There were also some other kind of unique provisions that we hadn't seen as before that move further than we'd seen before. So for example, in New York, it's legal to smoke marijuana on the sidewalk. I believe every other state has some kind of penalty, or there's local penalties for smoking in public. We also saw New York State Department of Labor say that their lawful off-duty activity statute now includes marijuana. So people for most jobs cannot be fired for testing positive for cannabis. Most of these states had also passed medical cannabis through the legislative process previously and didn't allow home cultivation. However, all of these 4 states at least will. A couple of them have a waiting period of a couple of years before rules are written. So in a lot of ways, these were broader than previous measures. There were provisions to make sure people aren't revoked on parole and probation for testing positive. In Connecticut, even first offense illegal sales is a decriminalized offense, so there's a small fine instead of jail time. So there was a real effort to have a much larger amount of conduct not be criminalized, not result in jail, to wipe off and automatically expunge prior convictions in many cases, and to prevent people from being discriminated against for using cannabis. So a lot of the bills have provisions so that state employers, in some cases, not in all of the cases, housing, people providing housing. They just generally have more protections for child custody than a lot of the previous states did. So it's been really exciting to see this amount of progress and this breadth of reform in these state laws. And also New Jersey is worth mentioning because there the legislature referred the issue to voters. It was not self-executing, so it didn't actually do anything until they implemented it this year. It didn't include home cultivation, but in a lot of other ways, it was also one of the broader bills for social equity and criminal justice reform.
So big year for sure. All right, so let's talk about a couple other items that were of interest. And honestly, I forgot who was going to take the first couple points.
I was going to take the first two and then kick it to Justin.
Okay,
so
perfect.
two other big
that
things.
way.
Alabama became the 36th state to legalize medical cannabis with a comprehensive bill that's not just low THC this year through the state legislature. It's a very limited bill. We have things we'd love to see change, but it is certainly huge progress. And in Louisiana, the state legislature decriminalized possession of up to 14 grams or about half an ounce of cannabis, which means that a person would get a traffic ticket of up to $100 or essentially like a traffic ticket. Or if the person has difficulty paying, then the judge would craft alternatives such as installment plans or community service. We'd love it to have been more than 14 grams, but this is really huge progress from where Louisiana was not very long ago. There were people that were sentenced to more than a decade in prison for if they had prior convictions for just a small amount of marijuana. So we're really excited to see the progress, but of course want to see more as well. And I'll kick it to Justin for the rest.
All right. Well, there have been so many other bills that have been passed in just the last year. So when you guys get the slides, I encourage you to check out NORML's 2021 legislative recap. Specifically, just to highlight expungement policies, because this is critical. We now exist in a day and age where we are saying the possession of marijuana, the consumption of marijuana is no longer a crime, but millions of Americans still have to check that box on job applications, housing applications, and that has a deleterious effect on their entire ability to be a full participant in society. So specifically outlined in our legislative report, again, check out our legislative report, is Colorado, Delaware, New Mexico, and Virginia all enacted laws specific to expungement policies, opening it up. Some of these laws were much broader, where it's going to be an automatic expungement and you'll get a letter in the mail. Other policies, they've just made it much easier for citizens to apply, or even now allow citizens to apply. So it really depends on where you live. So if you have a previous conviction, be mindful. You might have to proactively apply, fill out paperwork, maybe have to navigate the system in a much more complex way, but it is worth it to get that off of your record. And in just to put it in the biggest context, in 2021, we saw over 2.2 million criminal records get expunged from state or local units of government, thanks to the work of hardworking advocates, activists, local policymakers, and groups like the nonprofit Code for America that has worked with a lot of different governments to facilitate, so that way they just erased hundreds of thousands of records within minutes. So it's really, really exciting front right now happening around the country.
I hadn't heard that number before. That is a lot of lives affected.
In the normal legislative report.
Yeah, all right. Well then, shame on me. So at least I've linked it, and lots of other information is on this slide. And again, if you have questions, please do put them in the question panel. I am not monitoring the chat. The chat is for you guys. The questions are for us. All right, so I'm going to move on to some broader drug topics. And Tom has been doing a bang-up job kind of keeping an eye on what states are doing that, and some of these are just fascinating. So Tom, do you want to give us a rundown on starting with what Texas has done?
Yeah, one thing we are seeing around the country is that the debate about drug policy reform is moving way beyond marijuana, and lawmakers in a growing number of places are becoming more comfortable tackling broader drug policy reforms, whether that be decriminalizing all drugs or emphasizing and encouraging research on the benefits of psychedelics. So here are a few examples shown on this slide. And these are just examples of legislation that actually advanced in 2021 sessions. There were way more bills to decriminalize all drugs or reform policies surrounding psychedelics that were actually filed in even more states. But Texas actually enacted a law this year that requires certain state agencies to study the medical benefits of psychedelics like MDMA and psilocybin and ketamine to treat veterans with PTSD. And that was enacted without the governor's signature. He just allowed it to become law. So he didn't veto it, he didn't sign it, but it's law. It's the law now. And that bill itself has inspired very similar legislation that's already been filed in places like Florida and Pennsylvania. And the Pennsylvania one, we're actually expecting to have some committee action in the next few weeks. So keep your eye open for that. In California, an entire chamber of the state legislature, that is the Senate, actually passed a bill to legalize possession of psychedelics. It wouldn't allow any kind of sales. And so there is a bit of a dispute about terminology there. Some people describe it as decriminalization, but it would actually make the possession completely lawful. There would be no fine attached whatsoever. After passing the Senate, it then advanced through 2 assembly committees, but the sponsor decided to pull it back from consideration in order to give himself a little bit more time to garner the support he thinks it needs to pass the assembly and get onto the governor's desk. It is a 2-year session in California, so the bill is alive as such. And so we expect that to start moving again in the new year. In Maine, the House of Representatives passed a bill to decriminalize possession of all drugs. It did not pass the Senate, however, so that's dead. And then in Rhode Island, which is my home state, I'm from there, the legislature passed and the governor signed a bill to create a pilot program authorizing facilities where people can consume illicit drugs under medical supervision. It's a harm reduction measure that advocates believe will save lives because there's medical personnel there who can intervene in the event of overdoses. And so that has been a very interesting issue. There was a site that tried to open in Philadelphia, in Pennsylvania, but the Trump administration at the time filed legal action against it. The advocates that wanted to run the site won an initial court ruling and then lost an appeals court, then asked the Supreme Court to take a look at the case. The Supreme Court declined to grant a review of the case. And so now it's back in a lower court. And in the meantime, just last week in New York, the nation's first supervised consumption sites for illegal drugs actually opened. And so now everybody is wondering what, if anything, the Biden administration is going to do to try to enforce federal drug laws against those facilities, both in New York, as well as when the pilot program gets underway in Rhode Island. So those are just a few examples to show that the drug policy reform debate is moving way beyond marijuana at this point.
And there's so much interesting stuff going on at the state level. And this is why, you know, state legislation really matters, because if some of these are successful, then we might see them move across the country.
Oh, and I also should say this year we saw the first bill to decriminalize all drugs filed in the United States Congress. It hasn't gotten a hearing or any votes yet, but it is now there as a marker of how far the debate has come.
Yeah, that's an important marker. Okay, excellent. So I'm going to go ahead and take some audience questions before we move on to talk about the courts, which I teased you with. So let me pause for a minute, and I'm going to ask a question from Samuel. Is there anything going on to push forward USDA organic certification? Ooh, this sounds more like a regulations thing. As my multiple chemical sensitivities, I have to eat USDA organic foods. I've had some medical cannabis that has also caused some of the same symptoms as conventional foods. When will I be able to get USDA certified medical cannabis and hemp? Anyone have any thoughts on that? Crystal ball? No takers.
I'll say something, but I'm probably, I suspect that wouldn't happen until it's legal, completely legal and regulated at the federal level. Some states, I believe, have their own counterpart for organic certification. Certainly a lot have testing standards. This is something obviously with testing that would make sense, in my opinion, to be done at the federal level so you can have uniformity, and because they do, organic certification nationwide. But that's just a crystal ball of when will legalization happen, and I don't have a great prediction on that. Maybe somebody else does.
I'll jump in just to say that, to echo Karen, and also highlight, like, earlier somebody asked, why do people support federal regulations? It's things like this, in order to introduce some kind of level of uniformity around the country, so that way consumers can have confidence that if they're going to buy cannabis in New York, that it's going to not harm them, and if they're going to buy cannabis in another state, it's not going to harm them, or other things. So just highlighting that your question is really rooted in why we need some kind of federal baseline regulatory structure.
All right, so then Jacob wanted to build on that. What does the process look like for clear federal regulations on CBD products to ensure things like accuracy and labeling for products that are legal?
Who knows? A number of important members of Congress, as well as people in the hemp and CBD industry, have been pushing the Food and Drug Administration to finally take some sort of action to regulate those products. And there have been a number of bills filed to require such an action. But every time I see an FDA official talking about that, they're always just saying, "Hey, we're thinking about it. We're taking important steps," but they haven't actually proposed any such regulations yet. So I don't know.
Well, this is going to set up Shaleen pretty well to talk about why this matters. All right, so I'm going to take the other two questions at the end and move on right now to talk about the Supreme Court, the state Supreme Courts, and why are the Supreme Courts on our radar. So Tom, take it away. What's been going on?
Yeah, one thing we are increasingly seeing is a seeming recognition on the part of prohibitionists, that is, people who oppose legalization, that they can no longer defeat legalization at the ballot box, that legalization is incredibly popular, going back to what Karen was talking about with the Gallup poll recently showing 68% support among US adults. And so what they are doing more and more is trying to prevent voters from even getting an opportunity to decide on marijuana initiatives on the ballot, or working to overturn those initiatives after voters have already had their say and approved those measures. So last year, there were a number of states that voted on marijuana ballot initiatives. One state that was not able to vote on a medical cannabis initiative was Nebraska, where activists actually collected a sufficient amount of signatures to qualify the measure to go before voters. But there was a lawsuit filed, and the state Supreme Court ultimately removed it from the ballot on single subject grounds. And then in South Dakota and Mississippi, there were initiatives that actually did appear on the ballot, but which were subsequently overturned through litigation. In South Dakota, there were two separate initiatives that voters got the opportunity to decide on: one to legalize medical cannabis, one to legalize adult use marijuana. And the adult use marijuana one was challenged after the fact on procedural grounds. It lost in a lower court, and then the state Supreme Court spent many months deciding what it was going to do about that, and just in the past week or two decided to uphold that lower court ruling that that overturned the voter-approved adult use legalization initiative. And then in Mississippi, again, voters approved a medical cannabis ballot measure there, and that was challenged on some really arcane procedural rule having to do with the number of congressional districts in the state. Anyway, long story short, that also got overturned. And in all or most of those states, there are efforts underway now to kind of replace those overturned measures or to pass new measures. So in Nebraska, activists are collecting signatures to put a pair of initiatives on the ballot next year to get around that single subject rule. They're doing 2 separate measures. And in South Dakota, there are efforts moving forward in the legislature that could legalize marijuana, but there's also a proposed ballot initiative effort that's underway. So all the bases are being covered there. And then in Mississippi, lawmakers are talking about passing a bill to legalize medical cannabis. There was some anticipation that they would do that in a special session this year, but it looks like it'll be in the regular session next year.
All right. Thank you. I find that could be completely interesting about how we've moved from the legislative branch to the judicial branch, and they're getting involved as well. All right. So do any of you have any brief things you want to mention about state legislation before we move on? Because we are, of course, taking up all of our time already. All right. So there is one question I'm going to ask from the questions, and again, we'll address the other questions when we get to the end. So Jackie asked, in your minds, would federal legislation allow adults in the country, all adults in the country, to grow their own plants regardless of state laws and regulations? So is federal legalization?
As far as I know, there haven't been any such bills filed to force legalization on any states. There have been some pieces of legislation that would gently encourage states to change their laws. For example, Senator Cory Booker had a bill called the Marijuana Justice Act that would withhold certain federal funds from states that continue to have racial disparities in marijuana enforcement. And as long as marijuana is illegal, you're probably going to have racial disparities due to the way law enforcement has carried out law enforcement in the history of this country. So yeah, I haven't seen any bills that would force legalization on any state that doesn't want it. I don't know, Justin?
Yeah, no, I mean, it's federalism. You can't force the states to legalize. I will flag, though, that in the MORE Act and in the COA, there is affirmative language acknowledging the legitimacy and good nature of home cultivation laws. But that's written in the tax section. It's kind of like wonky. Again, you can't force states to legalize home cultivation, but you can incentivize it or at least explicitly give congressional intent that it is a good policy, which we did.
I'll just chime in that they remove federal penalties. A lot of the bills, the MORE Act and CAOA, removes federal penalties from home cultivation, but that's not who's busting people. Like if a state law makes cultivation illegal, it's state actors and local police that are the ones that are going to arrest you. So it doesn't really save people from where the jeopardy really lies.
Excellent.
I also want to chime in real quick that in Parabola Center's model changes to the MORE Act, we have sample language that would take a small amount of home cultivation of marijuana out of the Controlled Substances Act, so that could be done immediately without having to go through all of the changes and regulations.
Excellent. Good. Okay. So let's move on now to talk about regulations. So as I mentioned, so this is the executive branch. We have now hit our hat trick of branches of government. But so regulations, why are we talking about them? Like, how are they different than laws? And so at a high level, Shaleen, what have we got here?
Yeah, I'm really glad that you included this because I think any discussion of policymaking should include both statutes and regulations. And I think also if you are putting your own individual or your organizational resources into being influential in laws that are passing, I suggest you put at least that much into the regulatory process because it can really change the direction of a state or even, the trend in the whole country, if that happens with multiple states, which is what's happening. But just first to take a step back, I want to explain in theory what regulation is. And that's coming from my hat as an attorney For federal regulations, that's really the extent of my knowledge, is the theory. But at the state level, I spent the last 3 years as a commissioner at the regulating agency in Massachusetts and watched it from the inside. So I also have some practical tips and some places I want to flag where you could potentially be influential if you want to. So regulation is the process that agencies use to create rules. It's also called rulemaking or implementation of the law. And they basically decide how all of the broad laws will become in practice, where they'll go in practice. And the process that they use is usually set out by each state. They all look different, but it's similar in the sense that there's two really important things which are why you should get involved. And one is that unlike local officials and elected state officials who are important but generalists, regulators are specialists. They are cannabis people, just like all of us, even if they don't want to be. When they start, they're going to be cannabis people. And so they need to be experts, and they have a lot more time because it's their full-time job to dig in on these issues and to understand them. The second reason is that they are quite susceptible to public pressure, in my opinion, and there is a determined structure for how they include the public in their process. And so you should really take advantage of that with cannabis. And something that we're seeing, something that I heard from my government colleagues, is that in other industries and areas, you don't see the kind of activity that you see in cannabis. Like there'll be a hearing, and you'd expect that if it was anything else, nobody would show up, and it'll be packed, with hundreds of people. You'll reach your Zoom limit. And so this kind of public scrutiny and public feedback is exactly the way that we're supposed to be governed. It's a very good thing. And so, if you don't participate in that, you're missing out.
So how can people find out what's going on?
Yeah, so I'm just getting to that. So typically there is a timeline, and that's what this slide shows. And so it depends on who the agency is. So the trend now is to have an independent agency, like the one I was on, the Cannabis Control Commission or Cannabis Control Board, and that will be either independent or under the executive branch. But you may also have Department of Revenue or Department of Health or something that's already existing. Either way, the way that you find out is following their social media, signing up for their email lists, or in the worst cases where they're being the least transparent, you have to actually watch their meetings. But usually they will put some effort into making sure that they're announcing all of their hearings. And you can use tools, if you use some kind of tracker where every time something is put on the website, you get a notification, then you can be the first to sign up for a hearing, which is very useful because then you show up first, you're called first, and you kind of set the tone. Or if you go last, you can, address everything that's been brought up before. So either way, really good to participate in hearings. There's usually a timeline in the statute for how long the regulators have. I think a huge problem is that they are always, so far, too short. And when the timelines are too short, that means the regulators take shortcuts. The shortcuts tend to help the people with the most resources. And they're very panicked and pressed for time. And that gives them less of an opportunity to really respond to what they're hearing from constituents. So I would just encourage people not, even though I know you're very excited to get the legal marijuana in your state, not to push for timelines that are too short. There may also be an advisory group. Most states have some kind of group that is made up of different stakeholders, usually including industry, as well as law enforcement, public health, and other areas that are meant to discuss amongst themselves and then give recommendations to the regulators. And then within the agency, there is usually a group that is working on developing the policy. That's made up of lawyers, economists, people who are talking to constituents, and then subject matter experts. So this is the first thing I want to flag. There are very few actual subject matter experts, especially when it comes to the technical issues like cultivation and lab testing. And so what I see often is that there is an over-reliance on the subject matter experts and the lobbyists who proactively approach the regulators and participate in the hearings and perhaps provide model legislation. And so if you're a small business or a consumer or a patient, I really encourage you to, again, stay on top of the process and then use Marijuana Moment, NORML, Marijuana Policy Project. They have a lot of really great resources where you can find out what's going on in other states and then offer yourself as a technical subject matter expert, and that can really make a big difference, especially if you're in a group or a coalition of other groups that are all getting together to advocate for something.
Well, thank you. That's such an upbeat summary of the rulemaking process.
Can I flag just a couple more things?
Of course, please.
Okay, so there's usually a research agenda as well, and so you would have to either research how your own policies, the economic impact that they would have, often the effect they might have on farmers or small businesses, and then also research the way that the actual law is playing out, things like impaired driving, emergency room visits. And then this is extremely important. When you have a very complicated set of regulations, typically a regulating agency will issue what's called guidance. And that, unlike the regulations, doesn't have the force of law. So it's not like if it's violated, you get a fine or you lose your license. It's just there to explain what's happening. That guidance is really useful for if you have, for example, a municipality that is trying to be equitable, but they don't know how. That's something I dealt with a lot. Then we wrote a guidance, we said, here's something that you can do. And then they have some models to look at. So you can provide examples, and it's not with this same, as you see on the diagram here, really strict timeline and policy-making process that you have to stick to. So if you are a nonprofit or a small business, talk to regulators about guidance because it's a lot easier to do. And then I'll close by just noting that I have a paper out, just came out today. I'll put the link in the chat, and it goes through all of the ways that social equity has been incorporated in other states. And if that's something that you care about, you can come in as an expert. They love to hear about what's been done in other states because it's like pre-vetting, okay, if another state has done it, then we can do it. So I hope that will be a practical resource for you on social equity. And I'll just close with, make sure you pressure your regulators because they're more open to pressure than they probably like to appear.
If you also email me that link, I'll make sure it gets on the slides before we send them out.
I will.
So thank you for that. All right, so we're already eating into audience question time, and we haven't even gotten into the future, which I know you all want to talk about. Nonetheless, I'm going to take a quick question from Jax about regulations, and then we will move into what we think is going to happen next year. The good news is we already talked about most of the federal future, so we'll really be focusing on the states in the last section. But Jax has asked us, and hi Jax, great to have you. All right, so how can regulatory engagement help consumers and businesses ensure the government does not overreach? In Texas, we have seen regulations that overstep the statute and have led to lawsuits and confusion for everyone. So would you just recommend an eagle eye and participation to make sure that the regulators don't overstep?
Yes. And I think coming back to them afterwards with data, showing how it's been done in other states, if you can, that's what I saw worked a lot, is if you have a data, you have like a spreadsheet of the costs, then it can really help them make the decision that they want to make. I will also say that we see the opposite problem a lot. You see regulators that don't want to do something and they'll claim that they don't have the legal authority to do it. So either way, again, I think data and public pressure is the way to go.
Perfect, thank you. All right, and I'll just mention that Bill Track 50, of course, also lets you track regulations. So you can type in stuff and it'll bring up your state. All right, so we did have a few points.
Okay.
Sorry, please, Justin.
I want to say one thing on regulators too is influence who they're going to be. You don't necessarily have the ability to get existing regulators kicked out, but you certainly can engage with the people who are going to be deciding who's going to be in that seat next. And it is never too early to start. And I have already been for quite some time now, putting into the ear names that I think would make good federal regulators. And so that way when the time comes, that kind of socialization has already happened. You've already laid the foundation, so you're likely to get better regulators from the start, or replace the ones you don't like with ones who are more preferable to work with.
And as Shaleen just pointed out, a lot of the states are putting their boards together right now, so it's the perfect time to get your eye on that. So to that point, here are the states that have recently legalized either by ballot or by legislature, or have added, as we mentioned, medical. So these are the states that are going to be working on regulations coming up because they have to. So just keep that in mind. And then notable, maybe Karen wants to take our notable.
Oh yeah, I forgot we had a whole different slide on this, so I don't know that we have to go into it.
It's true, we did talk about it.
Yeah.
But yeah, so the courts stop that from happening. So no regulations there, no laws. All right, so moving on, I'm going to go ahead and fly through looking forward, which of course is probably why a lot of you came. So we are going to do a second on federal. Justin, I'm going to try to keep you short. And then we're going to talk about state because that is interesting. And hopefully we won't go too far over. And I'm sorry if I take a little extra time for everybody. But the federal outlook, I think you've already talked about most of this. But what other points do you want to make for what we might see next year?
I knew I saw the States Act reform somewhere. That's where it was. All right, yeah. So just this week, we saw the NDAA not include the Safe Banking Act as an attachment. I know that there's a big split within the advocacy community, with the majority of the advocates, I would say, supporting its inclusion, but a really earnest and good group who don't oppose or who don't support it for varying reasons. I do suspect that we're going to see other attempts to get the Safe Banking Act attached to moving legislation. So keep an eye out for that. Additionally, we're going to see the Cannabis Administration Opportunity Act finally get introduced. I would flag that a lot of the people who work in those 3 Senate offices on cannabis policy are the same staffers who handle the Build Back Better issue. That's one of the things that's really been delaying why we haven't seen that bill get introduced formally yet. So it's not too late to put pressure in if you want to see changes to the draft made. Now is a great time to be figuring out what your asks are, and hopefully they're going to be moving that package before Christmas, so that way you can get them fresh in the new year, right when they're sitting down to work on the bill. And then the MORE Act in the House. I am of the firm belief that we are going to see a vote on the MORE Act within the coming weeks. You know, and I'll just caveat that by saying coming weeks can include the number 12. So within the within the next couple months. But no, we do expect to see that. And I really encourage anybody who has members of Congress who are on the Ways and Means Committee to reach out to them and tell them that you want to see a vote right now. Or if they're on the Energy and Commerce Committee, tell them that you want to see a vote right now.
May I also just say a brief note about research legislation?
Yeah,
so at the end of the last Congress, both the House and the Senate passed broad bills to streamline the process of researching marijuana, but they were different bills, and it was very late in the year and nothing made it to the president's desk. So you may see efforts to, get together behind a singular proposal and advance that in the coming months. Also, it's worth noting that the House Veterans Affairs Committee just a few weeks ago passed a narrower bill on research directing the Department of Veterans Affairs to conduct clinical trials into the medical benefits of marijuana for military veterans. And so you may see that come to the floor at some point.
Excellent. And just to reiterate, it's a 2-year session. So what they're working on now continues forward into next year. So if they get something introduced or moves at the end of the year, it's still going to matter because it'll just pick up right where they left off next year. Okay, thank you. Those are excellent. Now to kind of the start of the show, right at the end of the meeting, sorry about that. Let's start with what states we think might have successful ballot measures put on their ballots for the next election. So Tom, give us a little rundown and handicap these guys.
Sure. So yeah, there are upwards of a dozen states where you may see marijuana initiatives appear on state ballots next November. As you can see on the slide, that's a list of them there. Most of these are citizen-led ballot initiatives, where activists file a petition and then collect signatures to qualify it. Those campaigns are in various stages of getting underway in the many states. Some have already been filed and are collecting signatures. Some people are just talking about filing an initiative in the coming weeks and months. And in some of the states, there are actually several competing campaigns working on their own measure. So you potentially could see multiple marijuana measures on certain states' ballots, which has happened rarely in the past, but it has happened a time or two. And then in some of the states, and I think Karen will talk about this in a second, like New Hampshire and Maryland, there are lawmakers who are talking about passing resolutions that would put a referendum on legalization on the ballot for voters to decide. So, some of these states are small, some of them are big. If you're in a big state, you have to collect a lot of signatures. That's very expensive. You have to, there are multiple media markets. Once you qualify for the ballot, you have to think about advertising. So, it is by far, it is far from the case that all the states you see here where people are thinking about putting something on the ballot, that it actually will make the ballot. You'll just have to stay tuned to Marijuana Moment and our coverage in the coming weeks and months to see how these campaigns are proceeding.
Of course, I made all the states the same size, regardless of population or square footage. All right, so do you have any that you want to highlight as very likely? Like, what would you definitely bet on if you were a betting man?
Oh, I don't know. I'm not a betting man. But I think in small states like South Dakota and Nebraska, and especially in those two states, activists have track records of conducting successful signature gathering drives. I would be surprised if those measures do not qualify. I'm I'd say a little more skeptical about some of the very big states like Florida, for example. However, Ohio, which is also a pretty populous state, there seems to be a well-organized, well-funded effort there to collect signatures for a legalization ballot measure. However, that's a little bit nuanced because it's a two-step process there with what they're doing. And the campaign has said they are at the tail end of the initial stage of the signature gathering, which will require the legislature to actually consider their initiative in the 2022 session. Once the activists collect this initial wave of signatures, the legislature can then consider it. They can adopt it as is. They can pass an alternate amended version of it. But if they don't do those things, then activists can collect more signatures to go ahead and put it on the ballot. And that campaign is saying that their plan is really to try to get the legislature to just pass it. So that's a bit of a hybrid scenario. So we'll see what happens there.
Yeah, a hook or a crook, as they say. All right, so moving on to Karen to give us a little bit of a picture about what legislatures might do, both about adult use and medical.
Yeah, so about half of the states in the country do not have a process where you can just collect signatures and put an issue on the ballot. So all the states I work on, most of them are ones where there's no possibility of that. The only way to legalize is either for the legislature to legalize, or in all states except for Delaware, the legislature can refer the issue to voters themselves, but usually it's a really short constitutional amendment, not a huge statute if they do that. So there will probably be another 18 to 20 states that will have bills introduced. The three listed here at the top are the ones we think are the most likely to have legalization actually pass in 2022. I would love to be surprised, but I would be very surprised if any other states actually pass it completely next year. Maryland, as Tom mentioned, is one of the ones that the Speaker of the House there said she wanted to put the issue before voters. We hope at least that they'll have implementing legislation that will take effect if and when voters approve it. Rhode Island is one of the states that looks the most likely to pass. No guarantees, but it's looking pretty good for 2022. I think at this point, there's no special session happening this year, but that had been discussed. And then Delaware is another state that's looking pretty good, but is far from certain. They need 60% in both chambers. It looks great in the Senate. They're pretty close in the House, but not quite there. The governor's not a fan, but that doesn't mean you would veto it. And they need the same margin to override his veto as they need to pass it. Turning to medical, there are a lot of states that, well, compared to most years, that could pass medical that don't yet have it. Of them, the most likely is probably Kansas, where one chamber already passed last year. The other chamber is ready to go. The governor's supportive. Mississippi, which, as was discussed, the Supreme Court threw out the voter initiative and the legislature appears very likely to replace it. North Carolina's powerful Senate Rules Committee chair has introduced a medical cannabis bill that has a lot of traction. South Carolina, we've been working with allies for many years, and at long last, the Senate leadership has said they'll get a floor vote. If it gets a vote, it has the votes in both chambers, we believe. So we could potentially have a surprise or two on medical. I think it's less likely we'll have a surprise on legalization, but there are a lot of other states where we're kind of, we and other advocates are building for future passage.
Mhm.
All right, so if you want to know more, we have a rundown of the ballot measures, a link here, and a rundown of just in general legislation at the state level, which will take you to a marijuana policy project. So check out both of those links if you would like to get an exact diagnosis of your state, which you probably would like. So again, these slides are coming to you. All right, so we are far out of time. In fact, we have exceeded our time. I apologize to the audience. However, if our panelists are able to stay for an extra 10 minutes, we will try to field some of the questions the audience has already given us. Is that okay with all of you guys? All right, so you guys drop off if you have to. Obviously, I have no hold on you, beloved audience. So if you need to bail, you will not hurt our feelings. All right, so let's just start with at the top. Okay, how can we convince Pennsylvania to legalize cannabis? 73% of Pennsylvanian people have spoken at forums, and the only ones holding it up are Republicans. Well, okay, any ideas on Pennsylvania in particular?
I don't have the solution to that, but I will just point out that you are seeing more, although it's a small number compared to the zero previously, more Republican lawmakers in that state who are now endorsing legalization, filing legalization bills. Of course, it's up to the leadership of those chambers whether those are actually going to be considered or not.
Thank you, Tom. All right, we've got Sanho. What's the status of Evanston, Illinois, and other cities looking to use marijuana taxes to address slavery reparations? Do you think this will catch on in other localities?
I can take that. I don't know the status of if it's actually in place, but I do know it has caught on in other localities. Right now it has passed in Cambridge. I think that it's been slow because there's a lot of questions as to who is eligible for them. But it's great to see marijuana tax revenue used that way. And shout out to Sanho Tree, who is the mentor to many of us.
I'll chime in with one thing on Evanston. It's actually reparations related to racial discrimination in housing is the way they classified it. So it's specifically based on people that had redlining or other discrimination in the city of Evanston who are getting reparations. And I believe that was crafted based on some legal concerns and figuring out, how to define qualifying entities.
Yeah, that definitely helps define eligibility. Great question. Thank you for bringing it up. All right, let's see. I'm going to move on to Lloyd. Is U.S. Cannabis Council for or against immediate passage of the SAFE Act? USCC is supporting the MACE bill, which has a tiny amount of social equity attention, while they demand a massive Schumer effort to comprehensively enact social justice provisions.
I don't think any of us work for USCC. Some of my coworkers wear two hats. I believe they support safe banking in order to,
Yeah, I've gotten a lot of press releases from them calling on lawmakers to pass safe banking immediately.
All right. Moving on from Mitchell. While banking reform is critical to grow the size of the cannabis industry, it will also grow the waste issues that go with current cannabis industry, which I guess, yeah, okay. Do you know of anyone in Congress or state legislature who is working on a bill to confront the cannabis waste issue and allow cannabis operators to recycle where waste, something many state regulations accidentally or intentionally ban? Any thoughts on, I'm actually going to make that a little bit wider, like any kind of, yeah, actually that's a good way to put it, waste.
Sure. Yeah, thanks for the question, Mitchell. I think you asked a similar one at our webinar 2 years ago, if I'm not mistaken. I don't know about recycling specifically, but you may or may not have seen there was recently a bill introduced by a New York State senator who was actually the daughter of the late former Congressman Maurice Hinchey, who was a leader on cannabis reform on Capitol Hill for many years. Anyway, her bill would incentivize sustainable packaging for marijuana products, including by emphasizing the use of hemp to make the packaging itself, which I found very interesting. But that's the one example of such a bill that sticks out in my mind. So hopefully that's somewhat responsive to your question.
Thanks, Tom. That's great. I love that you have that at your fingertips. All right, Samuel, again, and this is interesting, are any of the states or federal programs looking at access to the whole plant, including root-based medicine or fresh or juicing, especially if they do not allow home cultivation? Has anyone heard any rumblings along those lines?
I mean, all the states for legalization allow whole plant, and all the states that we count as effective medical cannabis laws, except the newest one, Alabama, allow whole plant. So,
okay, so yes. Excellent. Thank you. And then Dwayne wants to say that he really appreciates the panel and the speakers, and Tom, thanks. And MPP and everybody, you guys are great. And that's so true. So that is a great place for us to wrap up. If you have any further questions, go ahead and you can email me and I will get them to the appropriate panelist and we will try to get you answers. Thank you so much for coming. Hopefully you found several things in here that were interesting. And again, you'll get the slides so that you have further resources. If I get a chance, I will load the webinar up to YouTube and include the link to it on this thank you slide so that if you want to, you can watch it again. But any last words from each of the panelists? This time we'll start with Shaleen.
I guess my last word is just that I really appreciate seeing so much interest in social equity over the past year, but I'm also concerned that the way that it gets spoken about with federal legislation does not match what is actually in the federal legislation. And in fact, we might see, if any of the current bills pass, that social equity programs could no longer continue. So I hope people will pay attention to that and look at Parabola Center's resources on the subject.
Excellent, thank you. And Karen, any last thoughts?
Just folks, if you haven't already, sign up for MPP, and I'd say also NORML and Marijuana Moment and Parabola Center to tune in. We have lots of emails that go out to our state-specific lists when there's bills that are happening, so you can add your voice to it. State legislative districts are pretty small and legislators don't hear from that many people. So if you care about this issue and you haven't met with your state legislator already, you should do so and call them and be respectful and urge them to get on board.
I definitely want to echo that state legislation matters. All right, Justin.
Thank you, Karen and Bill Trek 50 for being NORML's tool as well over the years. It's been amazing. So folks can go to norml.org/act and contact their state lawmakers or federal lawmakers and support, and obviously get on all the groups lists. No, I guess I'll just say recap something I said at the beginning, which is now is the time for heroic activists and advocates and bureaucrats. And it is remarkable how much influence an individual or a small group of individuals can wield if they have the audacity to just show up a few times and to stay on message. So I really encourage y'all to just go out, go forth, take the resources from all of our different groups and outlets and change the world. So thank you again for organizing this, Karen.
Excellent. Thank you for coming. And Tom, take us home.
Yeah, thanks for organizing it, Karen. Thanks to everybody else for participating, especially my co-panelists. Yeah, I think it's pretty clear from everything we just discussed that there is a lot going on the state and federal levels, not to mention the local level as well, city councils and the like. And we really try to do our best to keep track of all that for you at Marijuana Moment. So, shameless plug, please subscribe to our newsletter, marijuanamoment.net. You'll get an email from us every weekday morning letting you know what happened the day before and what you can expect to happen that day and in the days after it.
Excellent. All right. And Field Track 50 is free to sign up for, so I'm going to throw that out there and thank all of you for coming. Thank you to the panelists. Thank you to our audience and your amazing questions. And we hope to see you back again around this time next year, and we'll do it all again. So thanks, everybody. Have a good day. Bye-bye.
Thank you.